Society of the Snow tells the true story of the crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 on October 13, 1972. The plane, a Fairchild FH-227, was carrying 45 people, including 40 passengers and 5 crew members. 19 of the passengers were members of the Old Christians Club rugby union team. Most of the remaining passengers included the rugby team's family members, friends, and supporters. The movie focuses on the experiences of the survivors and the difficult decisions they had to make in order to stay alive. Spanish director Juan Antonio Bayona went to significant lengths to ensure the film was historically accurate, both in terms of the visual details and the story. However, the movie still deviates from the true story in a number of ways, which will be revealed in this video. This is Society of the Snow, History versus Hollywood. At the beginning of the movie, the rugby players are finalizing plans for a trip to Chile to play against one of the top teams. Given that the match was only an exhibition game, it's true that many of them viewed it like a vacation. Like in the movie, player Pancho Delgado had to convince his best friend Numa Turcatti, who was somewhat indecisive, to come along on the trip. A neat tidbit to look out for early in the film is that real-life Andes crash survivor Nando Parrado has a cameo in the airport scene. He's actually the one holding the door for the actor who portrays him in the film, Agustin Perdilla. With regard to fact versus fiction early in the film, one of the most significant deviations from the truth happens after they board the plane. In Society of the Snow, the plane is flying a direct path from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile. In real life, due to bad weather, the plane was forced to make a stop in Mendoza, Argentina, where they stayed overnight. They took off again the next morning, and they begin to head southward along the mountains, and this is where we catch up with them in the film. There was indeed a joyous environment on the plane, and as the 1993 film Alive did, the film depicts the taking of the last photo from the plane. The young man seated on the edge of the seat is Gustavo Nikolic, who would ultimately survive the crash, but later perish in an avalanche. Although Santiago was to the west through the mountains, they had to fly southward first so they could cross through at a safer point without as many high mountains. Once they passed through the mountains and flew over the city of Curicó, Chile, they were supposed to turn northward and begin their descent towards Santiago. The co-pilot, who was flying the plane under the pilot's supervision, mistakenly thought he had already passed over Curicó and turned the plane northward early before they had reached the town. As you can see in the movie, the visual conditions were poor due to cloud cover, and he didn't realize he was still in the mountains when he turned the plane northward. He began his descent straight toward the mountains, and when he was finally in the last moment visually able to see a mountain in front of him, he tried to pull up, but the plane made contact with a mountain ridge, tearing off both wings and the tail cone. What was left of the fuselage went careening down a glacier at an estimated speed of 220 miles per hour before colliding with a mound of ice and snow. There's no doubt that this is one of the most visceral and jarring plane crash sequences ever depicted in a film. This is in large part due to the fact that the director chose not to use music in this sequence, but to instead focus on the sounds of the metal tearing, the bones breaking, and the agonizing screams of the passengers. What you see in the film is very much in line with the survivor accounts of the crash. A total of 12 people died initially in the crash, 9 passengers and 3 crew members, and it's true that several of them were ejected from the back of the plane. 5 more would die during the first night due to the critical state of their injuries and the bitter cold temperatures. They were stranded at an elevation of approximately 11,710 feet. In the movie, they discover that the pilot's still alive, and then they climb around and talk to him through a broken window at the nose of the plane. They refer to this person as the pilot, but in reality, this was the co-pilot, Dante Lagurara. It's possible they're just using a general term here by calling him the pilot, and it's also possible from their perspective they may not have known if he was the pilot or co-pilot. They're actually never named in the film. The pilot, Julio Ferradas, died upon impact in a rather gruesome manner, and like in the movie, the co-pilot, Dante Lagurara, was pinned against the control panel and badly injured. He tells them that they passed Curicó, which he had mistakenly believed and appears to still be in a state of confusion over. The last words we hear the co-pilot speak in the movie is when he tells Numa Turcatti, "May God be with you." However, in real life, He asked some of the passengers to retrieve his gun and shoot him to end his suffering. This is omitted from the movie. The passengers refused to end his life, and he died the following day. Much of what you see happening on the ground over the course of the 72 days they were stranded is largely historically accurate. Director J.A. Bayona conducted over 100 hours of interviews with the survivors and the families of those who perished. While doing research for the Society of the Snow fact-check article, I did confirm that an avalanche trapped them in the fuselage for 3 days. In real life, it struck close to midnight on October 29th, 17 days after the crash. I'm going to stop here and say that there will be spoilers ahead, starting with what I'm about to reveal about one of the movie's biggest fabrications. One of the biggest questions I had while watching the scenes in which they're trapped in the fuselage by the avalanche is, did Numa Turcatti injure his leg when he kicked out one of the plane's cockpit windows? In the movie, in an act of desperation and heroism, he repeatedly kicks the window until it breaks, and he sustains a rather deep cut near his ankle. He then proceeds to dig up and break through the surface of the snow, thus saving the group. He sees that the storm has ended, and they all begin to climb out. This entire scene with Numa is fictional and doesn't line up with the Society of the Snow true story. In real life, they spent hours taking turns digging a passage through the cockpit. Gustavo dug and reached the pilot's seat. He stood on the pilot's dead body and was able to reach the window. Then, Gustavo, Roberto, and Roy Harley took turns trying to push the window out of its frame, which was made more difficult by the snow that was pressing down on it. It was actually Roy Harley who pushed it free with a furious shove, as noted in Nando Prado's memoir, Miracle in the Andes. Then Harley dug up through several feet of snow and was able to look around. He saw that the storm was still raging, and he climbed back down where they waited several more days until November 1st. So how did Numa Turcatti sustain the injury to his leg? According to Prado's memoir, Numa injured his leg in a much less dramatic manner. The book states that someone trying to make his way across the dark fuselage had stepped on Numa's calf as he lay on the floor. An ugly bruise quickly appeared, and when Roberto Canessa saw how badly the leg had swollen, he advised Numa to drop out of the expedition. The leg infection, coupled with the fact that Numa refused to eat as much meat as the others, is ultimately what led to his death. Now, of course, the real tragedy of this is that whoever stepped on his leg and caused the bruise had to live with the knowledge that that's in part what led to his death. Now, pointing out this historical inaccuracy is in no way to say that Numa Turcatti wasn't a hero. He was highly regarded by the others for his compassion, his determination, and he was even almost seen as like a Christ-like figure. It's true that Numa Turcatti's death is what inspired Roberto Canessa to decide to hike for help the following day with Nando Prado and Antonio Vizintin. It's true that after a few days, when they realized that the hike was going to take much longer than they had anticipated, with no end of the mountains in sight, Antonio Vizintin decided to turn back so he could reserve food for Canessa and Prado. Something that I wondered about while watching Roberto Canessa and Nando Prado's 10-day hike unfold in the film is, towards the end, did Roberto Canessa get sick from eating spoiled meat? In researching the Society of the Snow true story, I discovered that this indeed happened. He was plagued with diarrhea and felt terrible. He became so weak that he couldn't walk unaided. In the movie, they spot a mule driver named Sergio Catalan across a river who helps them. In real life, there were actually 3 people who they spotted across the river. Sergio Catalan was one of the men. He shouted tomorrow, indicating that he would be back the next day. He kept his word and returned the next day, and like in the movie, they used a rock to throw a note across the river to each other. Sergio Catalan embarked for the nearest town on horseback, which is about a 10-hour ride away. He wouldn't return with help until the following day. While Sergio Catalan was gone getting help, Nando Prado and Roberto Canessa were cared for by 2 peasants, Armando and Enrique, who fed them and provided them with a hut and beds. When Catalan returned the following day with a dozen Chilean mounted policemen, Roberto Canessa and Nando Prado rushed forward and embraced him. "There is no need to thank me," he said quietly. He then whispered, "Thank God, thank God." In the movie, we watch Roberto Canessa bury the remaining pieces of meat that he has on him. This might seem like a symbolic act that's fictional, but he did actually do this in real life. The last significant deviation from reality in the film is that it buttons up the rescue nicely at the end and makes it seem much easier than it was. It's true that Nando Parrado rode along in one of 2 Chilean Air Force helicopters to help locate the survivors. The flight through the mountains was extremely rough, and at one point the pilot of Nando's helicopter asked his crew, except for Nando, if they wanted to continue. Nando instructed the pilot, but the pilot didn't believe that Nando knew where he was or that he could find his way back to the glacier. The pilot didn't believe Nando until they were almost right over the fuselage and he could see it for himself. In the Society of the Snow movie, the 14 remaining Andes crash survivors are all rescued at once. However, in real life, due to the high altitude, bad weather, and the helicopter's weight limits, only 6 survivors were rescued that first day, on December 22, 1972. 4 medics and rescuers stayed behind to care for the remaining 8 who were rescued the following day. It's unclear why the filmmakers didn't depict the rescue accurately, other than it would have added to the film's already lengthy 2-hour and 24-minute runtime. Well, I guess there's nothing else very interesting to talk about in the film other than the elephant in the room, which of course is their descent into cannibalism. Without getting into the gory details that might get this video restricted, I will say that there's nothing that stands out as being largely inaccurate when it comes to this. It's true that this wasn't a decision that they made lightly, as the film does an excellent job of showing. After becoming so desperate that they tried to eat the leather from belt, shoes, and luggage, they knew that they were going to die if they did not make the decision that they did. In fact, all 16 survivors resorted to cannibalism in order to survive the 2.5 months that they were stranded. It's true that as Roman Catholics, the religious convictions made the decision even more difficult. In the Daily Mail, survivor Roberto Canessa stated, "We knew the answer, but it was too terrible to contemplate. The bodies of our friends and teammates, preserved outside in the snow and ice, contained vital, life-giving protein that could help us survive. But could we do it? For a long time we agonized. I went out in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we were going mad to even contemplate such a thing. Had we turned into brute savages, or was this the only sane thing to do? Truly, we were pushing the limits of our fear." In the end, they turned to their faith to justify their decision. Some aligned it with Holy Communion, the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Others turned to the Bible, reciting John 15:13. "No man hath greater love than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." It's true that the movie's narrator, Numa Turcatti, was one of the people who were most reluctant to eat the meat. This left him in a weakened state, and as mentioned earlier, this lack of nourishment is possibly why his body couldn't fight off the leg infection. Now, how accurate is Society of the Snow visually? I had read articles that the film was shot on location at the Andes crash site in the Valley of Tears. However, this is not entirely true. The filmmakers did go to the actual Andes crash site during the time of year the survivors were stranded there, and they shot 360 degrees of footage of the mountains in the background. They utilized the help of drones to get the breathtaking shots you see in the film, which are largely historically accurate. However, the fuselage and the actors were actually filmed in Sierra Nevada at Laguna de las Yeguas. The backgrounds that were shot at the crash site in the Andes were then superimposed into the scene using visual effects. For shooting interiors, including the shots inside the helicopter, and also when the weather didn't permit them to shoot up on the mountain, they filmed in front of a giant LED screen that had the Andes background on it. What's amazing is it all looks so seamless in the film and true to life as to what they would have seen around them. As for the 1993 film Alive starring Ethan Hawke, it used the Purcell Mountains in British Columbia as a substitute for the Andes, making that film somewhat less historically accurate in terms of what you see visually. If you want to learn more about how Society of the Snow compared to the true story of the Andes plane crash, check out our article over on historyversushollywood.com that's linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.